Hi YouTube, Hawaiian Shirt Coder here again, and we're back at my Web API series. We've built our Web API, now we're continuing along the road of improving our Web API to make it more production ready. Let's have a look at something called Data Transfer Objects. So if you've been watching our videos up to this point, you will know that we have a complete Web API end-to-end with all the verbs implemented, but what we've implemented is demo where, so it's not really production ready. So the remainder of my videos are going to be on how we can improve our Web API using best practices and make it more production ready. So this is another video that demonstrates how we can improve our design. So this is what we've currently got at the moment. We've got an SMS sports management system Web API, and I've just used a section of the system at the moment to do with players, and a client application could connect to that at the moment and make various requests to get the data out, insert the data, update the data and delete the data. So with our Good Citizens hat on, I was looking at our current design to see where we could do a further improvement. So I've highlighted this with the two red discs on the screen. So at the moment, one problem with our system is we've got an internal model known as a player that is completely mapped one-to-one against our database table. And when a client makes a request to get a player or submit a player in or have any interaction with the player whatsoever, they need to know everything about the underlying internal player structure. So the data returned to the client is tightly coupled to the internal representation of the data. So so what does that actually mean? It means several things, and in this video we'll find out how we overcome those. One of the issues is we may be exposing data back to the client that is sensitive, for example passwords. We may also find that if we change the underlying database structure, so all of a sudden columns that the client is expecting no longer exist, we will break their application, so it causes break-in changes. So what we need to do is add a level of abstraction between what the client requests and sends to us and what actually internally gets stored, and that's what this video is all about. And we do this through a thing called Data Transfer Objects. So in this short video I'm going to talk about data transfer objects, what they are and why they're a good idea to use them. So when I was looking through our API, if we have a look at the get all players example, and when you execute this you get a payload back. You get the ID, the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number and the isActive player for each player. Now this is basically returning back our model, and our model is a representation of the data that we hold in our database. So this is where data transfer objects come in. Data transfer objects are often used between the different tiers of your application, and they sort of sit on the boundaries really. So one part of your system, or one tier, doesn't necessarily need to know about another part of your system. So at the moment our system, even though it's all clumped together in one great big monolith, our front end, our controller, needs to know everything about the persistence level or the model layer. So it needs to know everything to do with the player. That may or may not be what we need or require. So we use something that sits in between the model and what the controller sends back, and we use something called a data transfer object. So like I said, this breaks the coupling away from the persistence layer. In our case, returning all the details or properties of a player. So what are the advantages of having a data transfer object returned rather than using the model? So there's a few good reasons for doing this. If your database structure changes, the API must change because it's tightly coupled to that structure, and that change may introduce a break-in change that the consumer of your API may not have catered for or may not know about, so it may break their application. So by having a level of abstraction over the data, you can control that. Even when the underlying database structure changes, you can still return back the same shape of the data to the user. Also, some of the data we may want to hide altogether from the consumer of the data. So for example, just to get a list of users on the screen in an application, do we really need to expose some personal information like the player's phone number or email address? That's quite sensitive. We might want to hide that altogether from a general show me a list of all the players in our club. Maybe it should just be the administrator who can see the email address and phone number and not the sort of general user of the system. So a DTO lets us hide bits of information. And one other reason for using a data transfer object is some of the data might need to be in a different shape. So I was looking at this data again, and we have a property for first name and a property for last name. Now in our summary, really what we're going to display out in a summary of players is their full name. So maybe we could concatenate first name and last name together. So that is basically why we have some of the reasons why we have a data transfer object, and I'm going to show you how you implement one of those now based on this endpoint, the get all players endpoint. So let's stop this and start making some changes. So first of all, if we go to the endpoint, you can see at the moment we're basically returning all the players from the database, the in-memory database that we've got. So this is the structure that is persisting player information, and we're returning it verbatim back to the user. So first thing we need to do is we need to add a new data transfer object. So we do that as follows. We right click and go add new item class, and I'm going to call this player summary DTO. Now a DTO sounds very magical and mysterious, but basically it is just a class, and very much like a model, the DTO holds properties that reflect the data we want to transport about. So I'm going to change this to public, and then I'm going to create the properties that we require. So I've got those over here just to save a bit of time, so I'm going to copy and paste them into the screen. And you can see we've now got 3 properties. So we've got an ID, a full name, and is active player. So if you compare that to the overall model, we've stripped out the phone number and the email address, and rather than the first name and last name as separate properties, we've just got a full name. So that's the difference. So that's all we need to do. We've created our DTO object. Now we need to use it in our controller. So if we go back to our controller, so this method is going to change. So the first thing I'm going to do is comment this out, and then I'm going to add some new code. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called player summary, and then I'm going to use some link to turn back the structure of the data that we want. So if I go from P in memory database dot players, so I'm using query styled link syntax rather than method based syntax. You can do it either way. Just for this example, I'm using the query based, so it looks very much like SQL. If you're from that world, it should look familiar. So we're saying again, just select back all the players from the database, then then on a new line, do select new, and what we want is to create a new list of player summary DTOs. So we go player summary DTOs, and if you get a red squiggly when you're following along, it will mean that you'll need to bring in the DTOs as a using statement, which I've got there already. And then what you do is you open and close brackets, curly braces, and then you say, then basically what you do is you map the fields that you want that's in the underlying model table into our DTO object. So our DTO object has an ID, and that is going to come from the player.id. It's also going to have a full name, and the full name is going to come from basically the concatenation of the first name and the last name. So we go percentage dollar p dot first name space p dot last name. So first name space last name will give us a full name. That's good. And finally, we want the is active player equals, and this comes from the player model field is active player. So all of a sudden we haven't got any email or mobile phone number. And the final thing we want to do is, because this will return more than one, is wrap this whole statement in bracket and in a bracket and do a to list. So what I've done here is I've basically mapped one style of class object to another one, so a model object to a DTO object, and I've done that using link and creating a link projection, which is what this is. There are several ways of mapping objects to objects. One other way of doing this is by pulling down a NuGet package called Auto Mapper. So you do that by going to Manage NuGet Packages, select Browse, and then do a search for Auto Mapper. go, so auto mapper. What AutoMapper does is it basically does a lot of the boilerplate code of mapping one property against another that we've done in our projection here, but AutoMapper is sort of beyond the scope of our overall Web API series, so I've just done it myself rather than rely on a third-party package. Then all we need to do after that is rather than return OK again, but this time we return back player summary. Let's put a breakpoint on this. We'll get rid of this comment, and now this one should now use the data transfer object to return the data and hide sensitive information that we didn't want and reshape the data so we have a full name rather than a first name and a last name. So let's just try this out. So if we press try out, then press execute, we hit our endpoint. Again, this is still going into our in-memory database, which is of this shape at the moment. So it's got mobile phone numbers and email addresses and first names and last names. But once it pops out the other end, we now look at the player summary object. We've still got 3 records being returned: John Smith, Peter Parker and Ben Stokes. If we have a look at the structure of that data, it's a different shape. So we've still got an ID, now we've got a full name, and we've got an is active player. No email, no mobile phone. So this is just what we want. And back in the UI, we can see that new shape. So that's basically all I want to say about data transfer objects. You may say, well, if I always want to return everything that is in my model, do I need to use a data transfer object? Well, the answer is no, you don't, but I would recommend always using a data transfer object, because then you are not coupling your web API to your underlying persistent model or database. You can, if the underlying data structure changes underneath, you can still create the mapping to the user without any sort of breaking changes. So I would always recommend using a data transfer object, both for posting information up to your API and also getting information back, like we've done with this get player API example. So I thought I'd show you one more example of using a data transfer object. So in our previous little demo, we created a data transfer object to reshape the data for our get player method. And it looks like this. So it's no longer got the email or the phone number, and we've concatenated the full name. So I thought I'd do another demo that would show that data transfer objects can be used with any of the verbs. So this is getting data out. Let's try it with putting new data into the system, or more correctly, posting a new player into the system. So if we have a look at the post method at the moment, the post method is expecting a player as the data that gets passed in to the request. And that player takes this shape. Now, like I've said in the previous video, this field at the top is not a field the user is ever going to know what to supply as a correct value, because it is an internal field that is more to do with the infrastructure of our underlying data store. In fact, it is the primary key for the database. So what we're going to do in this demonstration is we're going to create a DTO that is basically the same shape as we've got here, minus the ID field. So let's just drop out of here and go into the code. So in the code, what I have done so far, just to get ahead of the game a little bit, is I've gone to my shared folder and I've gone to DTOs and I've created a brand new DTO called add player DTO. And this is what it looks like, and it looks like there's more information in here than there is. It's because I've added a great big comment, but basically I've copied all the properties that are in the player models class, with the one exception, that is the ID, because that's the bit we want to hide, because the user can never supply us something that would be valid for that. So in essence, we've just copied this minus the ID. I've written a couple of comments there just to be helpful. So notice no ID field in this DTO, as the ID isn't data a user would submit. It is purely an internal property of data, more related to the internal infrastructure of our system, i.e. the primary key of the database. An important distinction from the previous demo is because we are now submitting data to our web API, we still need to carry out the same data validations as if we were passing in the player object. So we still need to ensure that the first name, last name, email address and is active players are mandatory fields and they are supplied in payload. We also need to check that the first name is no longer than 10 characters, and we also need to check that the email address is actually an email address using the out-of-the-box data annotation email address that is a regular expression. So this is just to also highlight that data annotations don't just have to apply to models, they also have to apply to data transfer objects when you are submitting data to your web API. So we've got a new class, and this is going to sit between the request coming in to post a new player and the actual player model that is going to submit to the database. So the next thing we need to do is show you a new technique for mapping the object that is an add player DTO to a player model. So previously we did that, if we go back to our controller, previously in the get method we did that through getting all the players out of the database and then using a link projection to project out a player summary DTO. This time I'm going to use a different technique, and I'm going to use a thing called an extension method. I'm not saying one is better than the other, I just thought I would demonstrate a different way of doing it. Don't forget as well that I've also mentioned that there's a third-party package called AutoMapper that will do similar sort of things and has even more capabilities, but I'm not going to show that in this video as that needs a little bit of configuration, and I'm also sort of trying to work on the premise of not bringing in too many third-party packages, as that distracts away from the focus of just building our web API. So the next thing we need to do is go back to our shared library and create a folder called helper, which I've done already. So I did that by right click, add new folder, helper, and then what we need to do is add a class into here that will be our extension method. So we go class, and then we need to give our class a name. So I'm going to call this class this add player DTO extensions. And this class's job is to act as an extension method, which you'll see how that works in a minute. So let me just refactor this, make this public, and then I'm going to copy in some code again so you don't have to watch me type, and then I'm going to walk you through what the code does. So first, before I do that, this needs to be a static class. So all extension methods are static. Then I'm going to paste in this method. So it's, as well as having a static class, we've got a static method that will return a player, and its method name is called toPlayerModel, and what we pass in is the addPlayer DTO. So we're going to pass in an addPlayer DTO object, and this method is going to convert it into a player object. Okay, so that doesn't involve a great deal, to be honest. It's just going to map, again, it's just mapping fields and it returns it back. So nothing too exciting there. The final step is to go back into our controller, find the post method. So let's just close this one up and make some changes to that signature. So here's our post method, and at the moment our post method is expecting a player as its parameter. So we're going to change this, and it should become an add player DTO. Let's change this to DTO. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say var player equals DTO dot to player model, which is our extension method. So we pass in an add player DTO, and then immediately we convert that to a player object, and then our code works exactly the same as it did before. So let's just try this out just to see if it works as expected. So if we go to our post method, you'll notice straight away that our payload now looks different. It doesn't have an ID in it, and it doesn't have an ID in it because if you look at the scheme, we're no longer passing in a player, we're passing in an add player DTO. So let's just fill this in. We'll leave all the fields as is, because we're not really interested in putting in valid fields. We just want to test out the endpoint. So string and user at example.com is fine. Let's just go execute, and we come in. You can see we've passed in the DTO, no ID in there. We then run our extension method. Here we go. So we're passing in our DTO, and we're returning back a player object. There we go. So that's of type player. Then we carry on how we did before, using our hack to assign the player ID, and then everything should end up in the database. So if we just go F5, execute, this response has come back saying we've posted in a new record, and this time it's returned back a player record that includes the ID, just so we can see that. If we just call the get all players, we should have a new record in here as well, and yes, we do. So that's just another example of using a data transfer object, and just another technique for mapping one object to another object. So let's just wrap things up on this video to do with data transfer objects and refer back to our learning outcomes. So during this video we have gone through what are data transfer objects, or DTOs, why we use them, the limitations of coupling the data if we don't use DTOs. So our outside world is strongly coupled to our internal domain, which may cause problems with regards to breaking changes. DTOs nothing particularly magical. They are just purely classes, but they are a level of classes that has added a further level of abstraction into our web API. So our modified design now looks like this. So our outside world client wants to request a summary of all the players in the system. It makes a request using the HTTP GET, comes into the player controller, hits the correct method, and that method will go off and it will query the underlying player model in the database, return back a list of players, and then a mapping takes place that will convert that list of players into a suitable DTO object, which will hide sensitive information or reshape the data as required for that request. In our case, that becomes a get player summary DTO, which gets passed back to the controller, which in turn passes it back to the client. The same thing can also happen as well with post requests. So a client can post in a request, but this time they're posting in, rather than a player, they're posting in an add player DTO. That comes in here. Say this was that DTO. Again, some mapping would take place here to convert that DTO to a player object, so it's in a suitable state to then push into the database. So what we've done here is we've introduced a little bit more of a tiered approach. The outside world now doesn't need to know anything about our data access tier in terms of how it models the data. So I'm the Hawaiian shirt coder. That's the end of this session. Please remember to like, subscribe, share with your friends. Remember, keep learning, keep exploring, keep developing, and I'll see you next time.